She didn't ask for shelter. She asked for work, and that was the first thing that made the rancher set down his coffee cup and actually look at her. Mara Tillison had walked the last 4 miles into town because the wagon axle had cracked somewhere past the Cutler Ridge, and she wasn't about to sit beside a broken wagon waiting for charity that wasn't coming. By the time she reached the gate of the Holloway Ranch, her boots had worn through at the heel, and her hands were raw from carrying the one bag she owned. She stood at that gate the way a woman stands when she has already decided there is no version of this conversation where she walks away with nothing. Jacob Holloway had turned away 11 women in 6 years. School teachers with fine penmanship, widows with land of their own, a senator's niece who'd come all the way from Cheyenne with a trunk full of dresses meant to impress him. Every one of them left within a week, and none of them would say exactly why. Only that the man had a way of looking through people like they were glass that hadn't been cleaned. But Mara didn't come courting. She came asking if the ranch needed a housekeeper, and she said it without flinching, without softening her voice the way the others had, and something in that steadiness caught him the way nothing had in years. If you've ever walked into a room knowing exactly what you were worth, and not needing anyone else to confirm it, you already know how this story starts. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and stay with me to the end, because this one earns it. The morning before Mara arrived, Jacob had let his 5th housekeeper go in under a year. It wasn't laziness, it wasn't theft. It was that she'd hummed while she worked, some old hymn her mother used to sing, and he'd told her, flat, without apology, that he didn't pay for noise. Otis Marrow, who'd worked that ranch for 19 years, and had buried 2 wives of his own, watched the woman walk off toward the road with her bag over her shoulder, and muttered that the boss was going to die alone in that big house, and not even the dogs would miss the quiet. He didn't say it to Jacob's face. After 19 years, he'd learned which things you said out loud, and which things you just thought hard enough that the saying didn't matter. There were 2 kinds of stories told about Jacob Holloway in that part of Wyoming. The first kind were facts, and they were impressive enough on their own. 28,000 acres pulled out of land, most men had called worthless, 360 head of cattle, a crew of 40 hands who'd ride through a blizzard if he asked them to and never ask why. A house with 9 rooms, built solid enough to survive anything the territory threw at it, except apparently a family to fill it. He'd started with a single horse and a deed. Nobody else wanted at 22, and by 36 he had more land than half the county combined, and ate his supper alone every single night at a table built for 10. The second kind of story was quieter, the kind that got passed around in low voices at the mercantile or over cards at the saloon. The kind nobody told to his face. Those stories all circled back to a name, Adeline. Though nobody said her last name anymore, like saying it too clearly might summon something nobody wanted summoned. What had happened to her, whether she'd died or left or simply vanished out of the telling of it, nobody seemed entirely sure, or if they were sure, they weren't saying. All anyone agreed on was that whatever it was had taken something out of Jacob Holloway that never grew back, and that every woman who tried to court him afterward was really just knocking on the door of a house where someone else still lived, in spirit if nowhere else. Mara didn't know any of that the day she walked through the gate. She only knew her wagon was broken, her money was almost gone, and the foreman at the gate, a wiry, sun-cracked man named Otis, looked at her like he was deciding whether to laugh or warn her off. "You looking for the road to Larkspur?" he asked. "I'm looking for work," she said. "I heard there's a ranch out here that can't keep a housekeeper." Otis actually did laugh then, short and surprised. "That obvious, huh? I passed 3 women on the road into town telling anybody who'd listen never to take the job. And you walked here anyway." "I need the work," Mara said, like it was the simplest fact in the world, which it was. She wasn't being brave. She was being honest. And there's a difference between those 2 things that most people never learn. But Mara had learned it the hard way. The way you learn things when you've buried a father and a brother in the same year and learned that grief doesn't pay rent. Otis studied her face a long moment. The kind of look a man gives when he's trying to decide if someone's about to become a problem or a solution, and then he sighed like a man resigning himself to something. "Mr. Holloway's particular," he said, "doesn't like noise, doesn't like questions, doesn't like flowers on the table, or hymns in the kitchen, or anything that reminds him there's a person doing the work instead of a ghost." I don't Mara said. And I don't ask questions I don't need answered. We'll see, Otis said, but he was already turning to lead her up the drive, and something about the set of his shoulders said he half hoped this one might be different. Jacob Holloway was in the barn when they found him, sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms streaked with the kind of dirt that doesn't come from being careless, but from working harder than the job required. He didn't look up right away. He finished what he was doing, resetting a shoe on a gelding that didn't want to stand still, before he straightened and turned, and Mara had a full 3 seconds to take him in before he ever looked at her. Tall, built like the work had built him rather than the other way around, a face that had probably been handsome before it learned to hold itself so still, and eyes the color of creek water in winter, clear, but cold enough you didn't want to stay in them too long. "This is Mara Tillison," Otis said. Wagon broke down on the Cutler Road. "She's asking after the housekeeper position." Jacob's eyes moved over her once, the same assessing look Otis had given her, except colder, more practiced, like he was checking a horse for a limp he already expected to find. "You won't last the week," he said. Not cruel. Just flat, like a fact he was saving her the trouble of discovering herself. "I didn't ask how long I'd last," Mara said. "I asked if you need a housekeeper." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth, nothing close to it, but a kind of recalculation, like a man who'd expected one answer and gotten another, and didn't quite know what to do with the surplus. "Room's in the back of the house," he said finally. "Wages paid Friday. I don't want to hear you in the mornings before I've had my coffee, and I don't want flowers in my kitchen. Can you manage that?" "I can manage silence," Mara said. "I've had practice." She didn't explain what she meant by that, and he didn't ask. He just nodded once, short, and turned back to the horse. That was the whole of her. No welcome, no kindness, nothing that would have told a stranger this was the beginning of anything at all. But Otis, walking her up toward the house, glanced sideways at her with an expression she couldn't quite name yet, and said low enough that only she could hear it, "Well, that's the longest conversation I've heard him have with a woman in 2 years. The first weeks were exactly as advertised. Cold, exact, wordless. Jacob left before dawn and came back well after dark, and the house in between belonged entirely to Mara and her work. She learned the rhythms of it the way you learn a stranger's handwriting, by paying attention to small things. He liked his coffee black and scalding, no matter the season. He ate fast, like eating was a task to finish rather than a pleasure to have. He never once commented on a meal, good or bad, which told her more than complaints ever could have, that he'd trained himself out of noticing things, because noticing things meant caring about them, and caring about things had apparently cost him too much once already. She didn't ask about Adeline. She heard the name exactly once, from Otis, late one evening when she'd stayed in the kitchen scrubbing a pot, longer than the pot required, mostly because the kitchen was the only room in that big house that felt like it belonged to anyone living. Otis had come in for water and lingered, the way men linger, when they've got something on their mind they're not sure they should say. "You're doing better than the others," he said. "I haven't done anything. I cook, I clean, I stay quiet. That's exactly it." Otis leaned against the counter, turning his glass slowly. The others tried to fix him, brought flowers, hummed, asked him questions about his day like they could talk their way into something. "You just do the work. Don't perform at him." "Should I be performing?" "God, no." He almost smiled. "That's why you're still here." Mara wrung out the rag in her hands, didn't look up. "Who's Adeline?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer at all. "His sister," Otis said finally, "younger by 6 years. Raised her himself after their folks died of fever. He was barely 17, she was 11. Spent half his 20s making sure she had everything. Sent her to school in Denver, built her a room in this house bigger than mine. She got sick 3 winters back. Consumption. He sat with her every night for 4 months, and it didn't matter a damn bit in the end." Otis set his glass down with more care than it needed. "He doesn't talk about it. Doesn't let anybody mention her name in this house. I figure he thinks if he stays quiet enough, it won't have happened." Mara felt something tighten in her chest, not pity exactly. Pity was the wrong shape for what Jacob Holloway needed. She could tell that much already, but something closer to recognition. She knew what it was to build a wall so high you forgot you were the one holding the bricks. "That's not a wife he's been refusing," she said quietly. "That's a man who thinks loving someone is how you lose them." Otis looked at her like she'd said something he'd known for years, but never had the words for. "You figured that out in 3 weeks," he said. "Took me 3 years." She didn't say anything else that night. But something had shifted in her, quiet and certain, the way water finds a crack in stone it didn't know was there, until it had already started moving through it. The weeks turned into a season, and the season into something neither of them named. It wasn't courtship. There were no words for it, no gestures, nothing a stranger watching from outside would have called romance. It was smaller than that, and somehow larger. It was Jacob coming in from the cold one evening to find she'd left a plate warm for him, even though supper had been hours past, and saying nothing about it, but eating slower that night than he ever had before. It was Mara learning, without being told, that he took his coffee on the porch in the mornings when the weather allowed, and starting to bring it out to him without a word, setting it down and walking away before he could turn the gesture into something he had to respond to. It was the two of them, most evenings, ending up in the same room without ever quite deciding to. Him at the desk going over the ranch's books, her mending by the fire, neither of them speaking for an hour at a time, and somehow that silence stopped being cold and started being something else. Something that didn't have a name yet, but had a shape, and the shape was company. It was Garrett, one of the younger hands, barely 20, with more mouth than sense, who first said out loud what everyone on the ranch had started to notice. He said it at supper in the bunkhouse, grinning, not unkindly. "Boss has been humming." The table went dead quiet, the way a room goes quiet when somebody says a true thing nobody was supposed to say first. "He has not," said one of the older hands. "I heard him. This morning. By the barn. Wasn't even a real song, just humming." Under his breath. Garrett looked entirely too pleased with himself. "Man hasn't hummed since I started here." Otis, who'd known Jacob longer than anyone at that table, didn't say anything at all. He just looked toward the house, where a single window glowed gold against the dark, and allowed himself, for the first time in a long while, something close to hope. Mara felt the change in herself too, though she fought it harder than Jacob did, because she had her own reasons to distrust the way her chest tightened when he walked into a room. She'd loved once before, a boy named back home, before her father's death scattered what was left of her family across 3 states. And she'd learned that love, the kind people sang about, had a way of asking you to disappear a little so someone else could feel bigger. She'd promised herself, walking away from that life with nothing but a bag and a debt, that she would never again make herself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of a good wife. So when she felt herself softening toward Jacob Holloway, she didn't trust it right away. She watched it the way you watch weather you're not sure you believe yet, waiting to see if it would turn into something that asked her to disappear too. It didn't. That was what surprised her most. Jacob never once asked her to be quieter than she already was, never once corrected the way she ran his kitchen or kept his ledgers, because somewhere in that first month she'd taken over the books too, simply because she noticed the columns weren't balancing and couldn't leave a wrong sum sitting on a page, and never once made her feel like her presence was something he was merely tolerating. If anything, the opposite happened. He started asking her opinion. Small things at first, whether the new fencing should run north or west of the creek, whether they should sell off part of the herd before winter or hold, and then larger things, things that weren't really about fencing or cattle at all, but about whether he was right to keep living the way he'd been living, alone in a house with 9 rooms and 8 of them empty. The turn, the real turn, the one that mattered, came in October during the first hard storm of the season. A heifer went into difficult labor in the worst part of the night, the wind screaming sideways across the yard, hard enough to knock a grown man off his feet. And Jacob went out to the barn himself rather than waking the hands, because that was who he was. A man who'd rather suffer alone than ask for help, even when help was 20 yards away in the bunkhouse. Mara woke to the sound of the door banging in the wind and found the house empty, his coat gone from the hook, and she didn't think. She just pulled on her own coat over her nightclothes and went out into the storm after him, because some decisions aren't decisions at all, they're just the truth of a person finally showing itself. She found him in the barn, soaked through, blood on his hands up to the wrist, fighting to turn a calf that had come wrong, and for the first time since she'd arrived at that ranch, she saw Jacob Holloway afraid. Not of the storm, of losing something. of standing in a barn at 3 in the morning watching a life slip away from him while he did everything right, and it still might not be enough. And she understood, watching his face in the lantern light, that this was the exact shape of every fear he carried, the one he'd built the whole cold fortress of himself around. Loving something meant the possibility of losing it, and he'd already lost too much to risk it again. "Tell me what to do," she said, and didn't wait for an answer, just moved to where he needed another set of hands. They worked together for the better part of an hour, soaked and freezing and silent except for the necessary words. Pull here, hold there, now. And when the calf finally came, slick and trembling but alive, both of them collapsed back against the stall wall, breathing hard, blood and straw and rain on both of them. And Jacob looked at her, like he was seeing something he hadn't let himself see in years. "Why'd you come out here?" he said. Not a question, really. More like he was asking himself. "Because you needed someone, and you weren't going to ask," Mara said. He was quiet a long moment, the storm still roaring outside the barn doors, the new calf already trying its legs in the straw. "Adeline used to say that about me," he said, and it was the first time he'd said the name out loud since Mara had come to the ranch. "That I'd rather drown than call out." "What happened to her?" Mara asked, gently, because she already knew the shape of it and only needed him to be the one to say it. So he told her. All of it. The fever that wouldn't break, the 4 months he'd sat by her bed reading to her, even after she stopped being able to follow the words, the morning he'd woken from an hour of sleep he hadn't meant to take, and found her already gone, and the particular, specific guilt of that, not being there, even for an hour, even when he'd been there every other hour of 4 straight months. He told her how he'd closed up half the house afterward, how he'd stopped letting anyone hum or sing or leave flowers on the table, because all of it reminded him of a girl who used to fill that house with exactly those small, foolish, beautiful sounds, and how somewhere in the years, since he'd convinced himself that an empty house was safer than a full one, because you couldn't lose what you never let yourself have. "I'm not trying to replace her," Mara said when he finally went quiet. "I know I can't. I don't want to." "I know," Jacob said. "That's not." He stopped, searching for words he clearly hadn't used in a long time, the muscles of his face working like a man trying to remember a language. "That's not what scares me." "Then what does?" He looked at her for a long moment, the lantern light catching the exhaustion and the rain and something rawer underneath both. "That I could lose you too," he said, "and I'd have nobody left to blame but myself for letting you matter in the first place." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't the kind of declaration men made in the stories Mara had read as a girl, full of promises and grand gestures. It was just a tired, frightened, honest man telling her the truest thing he knew, in a barn that smelled of blood and rain, with a newborn calf finding its feet a few yards away, and it was, Mara thought, the single most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, precisely because it cost him so much to say it. She didn't answer with words. She crossed the few feet of straw between them and put her hand against his jaw, the way you'd settle something that had been trembling too long, and he closed his eyes and leaned into it like a man finally allowed to stop holding his own weight for a moment, and that was the whole of it. No kiss yet, no promise spoken aloud, just 2 exhausted people in a barn at 4 in the morning, finally telling each other the truth. The wedding, when it came that spring, was small and plain, exactly the way both of them wanted it. No senators' daughters, no fine dresses sent from Cheyenne, just the hands from the ranch standing in the yard in their good shirts, and Otis, grinning wider than anyone had ever seen him grin, standing close enough to elbow Jacob in the ribs right before the vows and mutter something that made the groom actually laugh out loud. Right there in front of everyone, a sound so unfamiliar that half the hands looked at each other like they'd witnessed something rare and a little holy. Mara wore a simple blue dress, nothing fancy, because fancy had never been the point of anything between them. When Jacob said us, his voice caught once, on the line about not being good at this, at loving, at staying, at letting someone matter, and he stopped, and the whole yard went quiet, waiting to see if he'd managed to finish it, and Mara reached out and took his hand, not to rescue him, just to remind him she wasn't going anywhere while he found the rest of the words. And he did find them. Rough, plain, entirely his own. A promise that he would try, every single day, to be a man worth the risk she'd taken on him. And that even on the days the trying came hard, he would never again let silence stand in for the truth of what she meant to him. That evening, with the hands gone, and the yard quiet and the first stars coming up over land that had been his alone for 14 years, and was now finally theirs together, Jacob found Mara standing by the kitchen window, the same window where a year before he'd once thrown out a perfectly good housekeeper for the crime of leaving wildflowers on his table. There was a small jar of them sitting there now, ordinary prairie flowers Mara had picked that morning without asking permission, because she didn't need it anymore, and he hadn't said a word against them. He came up behind her and rested his chin lightly against the top of her head, an easy, unthinking gesture that would have been impossible from him a year before, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "You were humming," he said finally, "this morning, while you were picking those." Mara smiled, surprised he'd noticed, surprised at how much it meant that he had. "I didn't think you minded anymore." "I don't," Jacob said, and there was something almost wondering in his voice, like a man still getting used to the sound of his own house being full again. "I think I missed it longer than I let myself know." Outside, the wind moved soft and ordinary through the grass, none of the violence of the storm that had first thrown them together, and somewhere out past the barn, a calf that had nearly not made it through that night a season ago grazed easy in the last of the evening light, alive and unaware of what it had cost to keep it that way. Mara turned in Jacob's arms and looked up at a man who had spent a decade convincing the whole territory he was made of stone, and saw instead exactly what she'd seen that very first day at the gate. Not coldness. Never coldness. Only a man who'd loved so hard once that he'd mistaken silence for safety, until a woman walked up his road in the middle of a storm and showed him that the bravest thing two people could do was stay, on purpose, every single ordinary day, and call that staying love.